In this video, we're going to look at how to go about attempting and approaching a close passage analysis. The format of the assessment task looks like this. So you'll be presented with 3 passages from the text that you are studying. Now, in this case, we are looking at poetry, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be looking at the whole of a poem as the assigned passage. And you can see from the second and third here that what we're actually looking at are just extracts from broader poems, whereas the first one is a poem in its entirety. And that's a very common occurrence when you're looking at poetry in a close passage analysis format, but will be similar when you're looking at any other text as well. You will have 3 extracts which have been selected on purpose to try and draw your attention to some of the specific big ideas and concerns of the author. So when you're first presented with the passages in such a fashion, your initial reaction should be looking at them and ascertaining what it is that you're dealing with, which sections of the text do they come from, or in this case, when were these particular poems written, what publications potentially did they come from, and starting there, whilst also going through and reading through the poems, making sure that you understand exactly which poems you're working with, and then getting really stuck into the close passage analysis itself. So if we have a look at the 3 that are presented here, this is a sample set that we've put together for your preparation for the assessment task. One of the first things to draw your attention to is the fact that you're going to be given the instruction that you are to respond to at least 2 of the passages. So for this task and for this outcome, a minimum of 2 need to be worked with. It is up to you whether you choose to then incorporate a 3rd passage into your response, but at the very minimum, you need to be using at least 2 of them. It's not enough to only analyse one of the passages. So something really important from the onset to keep in mind. If we have a look at the different poems that we have presented here, we can see that the very first one is Shadows, which was the newest of the poems that we had in the publication studied. The other 2 poems are not ones that we've explored for study, but I've referenced them in some of the different discussions we've had whilst unpacking the poems. But again, knowing when they were published gives a little bit of context as to what was happening in the poet's life around about the times that they were written. Now, if we work our way through the poems, we'll go through one by one. We'll start having a look at some of the really key ideas that are being brought to the fore in each of the poems themselves. As you annotate, you should be doing this obviously with a set of highlighters and some pens or coloured pens, so you're able to start distinguishing between some of the different things that you're looking at immediately whilst you work. Okay, so let's begin with Shadows to start off with, and we'll spend a little bit of time pulling apart some of the different things that we can see with this poem. It starts, "We follow them around, or trot ahead, besotted, rather, by some dream of freedom, but they stay anchored to our heels and toes. Even a factory may lay claim to one which, in flat parody, will serve to add a cloak of shoddy dignity. For a sundial, say those my father made, the swivelling triangle of shade becomes a clock, distinguished by pure silence. When you reach the equator, if you do, you can pretty much find yourself standing calmly on top of most of one, your own personal double, that is. But they learn self-denial, abnegation, on any day with solid banks of cloud. The cinema is built on them, of course. We sit and gawk at dames with cigarettes cavorting on the screen of Plato's cave. But long ago in a vertical foreign city, I spoke to the living shadow of myself, both of us in herringbone overcoats, and then again a few weeks later, 1 block east. No, that was quite enough. I want to be the one I really am. Shadows are marvellous for photographs, those good old artful ones in black and white. I had dinner with Walker Evans once, only the shadow of what he once had been, as a metaphor might say of him. But he's gone off long since to join the shades, as have too many of my friends. When they peer back these days at their former lives, what sort of insubstantial echo would they see? Where I think myself standing. Featherlight, translucent, grey, umbrageous, or hardly a skerrick of what they once had thought. Evening, the sun tips us all back into shadow, reminding me that we are something less than our chunky, colourful, diurnal selves. And still we reach out for the ghost of truth. So this first poem, the last or the newest in the collection that we're looking at, to begin with, if we start with some of the really structural elements, get stuck into the more obvious elements to begin with, we can see that he's organising it in tercets all the way throughout. So quite a structured response, and we can infer that it's a structured response, a very deliberate contemplation. And the fact that this is so late in his life makes a lot of sense, that we're seeing a really deliberate contemplation on his part at his age. 2013, he's in his mid-70s at this point. So we're seeing quite a contemplative author at this point in time, with the way that this poem is measured and structured. We can also see that the first sets of stanzas, each one is organised in a very similar fashion. If you have a look, they're a continuous sentence each stanza to start off with. And we see the use of enjambment. In all of these lines, where the line directly flows into the next, and we don't really get any concerted stop until the end of each one of the thoughts. What we can see also with these first stanzas is quite a realistic approach, or a more literal approach, to the idea of shadows. All right. The idea of a factory may lay claim to one, or a sundial, or when you reach the equator. These very solid, concrete descriptors of shadows, likewise with the cinema, that each one is a more literal representation of what is going on with this idea of the shadow itself. As the poem progresses, however, we start to see that it takes on a greater meaning for the poet, that the shadow he's referring to is actually more himself, his aging self. And this switch becomes really apparent when we get to this caesura here. This pause. So it's a deliberate interruption. from the poet. And in that sense, we're seeing, a very lyrical, conversational style of poetry, in the sense that he has no qualms pausing himself, interrupting himself, in a similar fashion that you see over here, where he's thrown in the aside. So we're getting a very conversational, lyrical style overall. And in many respects, it's almost as if he's having a conversation with himself. Now, some of the interesting lines that we can see throughout this that give us pause and things to look at. Oops. Things like the fact that he has this really interesting contemplative moment where he's referring to his father, who's since passed. And likewise, how he talks about these shadows that stay anchored to our heels and toes. These personal doubles that learn self-denial and abnegation. Each of these lines create or emphasize that contemplative, reflective tone outlined at the start. When we get to that interruption, however, it does change in focus. It does really look back on who he thinks he himself has become, and what he wants to be still moving forward. He says, "No, that's quite enough. I want to be the one I really am." It's a really interesting line in this poem. If we think about him at this age, he could be thinking about this idea of the shadow being his former self, his youthful self. However, he says, "No, I want to be the one I really am." So perhaps what we can infer then is that he's embracing his old age. He's embracing this latter part of his life. He even has this contemplative or reflective moment, a memory of dinner with Walker Evans. And you've got this play on words here of the word shadow itself, where we're looking at this idea of, barely what they used to be, which is an interesting contradiction to this idea of shadow up here. It's quite the contrast. Here, he's referring to shadow as not the full version, not the full live colour version of what he had once been. And then he again plays with that term here, but he's gone off long to since join the shades. So this reference, if you like, to those who have died. And he can see here, when he talks about his friends, that they peer back these days at their former lives, as if that part of them is gone. And with the way that he's chosen to end this poem, he's then coming back to himself. You know, what sort of insubstantial echo would they see where I think myself standing? So this contemplation of an insubstantial echo. An echo is bringing forth that idea of a sound that's not quite the original, right? A weakening copy, an ever weakening copy. Where I think myself standing, featherlight, translucent, grey, umbrageous, hardly a skerrick of what they once had thought. If you look closely at the types of words that he's using here, they themselves carry with them that tonal quality of being light themselves. The sound of each word is light. He's deliberately chosen to use those terms so that way he creates not a substantial, solid feeling, but this echo that he's talking about. So he's having this contemplative moment. He's thinking back on his life, on those of his friends. He's considering all of the different things that have come to pass and how he himself is potentially only a shadow of his former self now in his old age. But then you get this conclusion. Evening, the sun tips us all back into shadow, reminding me that we are something less than our chunky, colourful diurnal selves. This idea that we're all going to age. We're all going to eventually, wither and fade away. That all of us are human. So quite a morbid thought in the sense. But then we get this single line right at the end, and still we reach out for the ghost of truth. This is quite the hopeful ending. The ghost of truth kind of connects with that idea of the thing itself, which is one of his other poems in the collection we're studying. The meaning of it all, purpose, life. In spite of our morbidity and the fact that we are eventually going to die, people still strive, people still go to live. And so he ends in quite a hopeful fashion with this first one. The second poem, Timber, you'll note it's not the entirety of the poem. It's a structured poem that has 9 different sections, and this excerpt that's being used for this passage starts at the 6th one. Apologies, that should say 6. It's a very different type of poem in that it's a reflection on wood, essentially. But Chris Wallace Crabbe using the natural world to explore different ideas. It's a very romanticised poem in that sense, because he's focusing in on something natural to try and convey a broader meaning. Lingered smell of Scotch pine, aromatic as a bunch of lavender, stars bursting through the jagged branches, and little tags of resin sticky on both my hands. So we're seeing interesting structure. And you're also noticing straight away that he isn't choosing to structure any of the verse in a formal manner, as he has done with shadows. This is far more free form. And it does have that romantic or romanticized quality about it. There's also far less literal writing, and we see that emphasizing that romanticized idea. Stars bursting through the jagged branches and little tags of resin. It is what he sees, but the phrasing of it is quite the romanticized approach. The shouldering ash tree, close, green feathery, witch encumbered, was felled at 11 today. A tree man shinnied slowly up the living trunk, riding on spiked boots or futuristic gaiters. Big branches came stripping away, each with a soft crash. A white snow of nuptial sawdust lies across the backyard. The sky can get at us now. More and more stars in my hair. With this little section, we see the felling of an ash tree, right? So it's been cut down at 11 today. It's quite the big ornament in the backyard of the speaker in this poem. And the fact that it's been cut down, it's been stripped away bit by bit, and all that's remaining now is this white snow of nuptial sawdust across the backyard. He's got this idea of something disappearing from his life, or the fact that this tree, just like every other tree that is used for paper milling or anything like that, it has its own life, it grows, and then it comes to an end. And in this sense, he's quite eloquently describing the end of this particular tree. He goes on then to say, alone in coffee-coloured twilight, you gravely turn back to unresponsive others, granite, water, and wood. Wood is the hand's old friend as club or careworn grip into a rocking green treetop, grainy for tool or sport. Split breadcrumb can cry, splinteringly to the heart, or a whippy branch whistle through air, the life still in it. When I smell timber, it flows inside me, touching its edge. I feel the coarse flesh of all being. But in a stand or copse of wind-lashed alterity, I might now also hear the first gods murmuring. Now, there's a few different things going on here. It's far more abstract, this poem, compared to Shadows, which has its abstract moments itself, but seems to be a lot easier to discern than this one. But we can infer that he, finds meaning in nature. Or at least tries to. When he says, when I smell timber, it flows inside me, and I feel the coarse flesh of all being. And the syntax here emphasizes that he feels alive, that he feels all coarse flesh, the coarse flesh of all being. And that he also contemplates from a more religious or existential perspective, standing in a copse of wind-lashed trees. This first, the first gods murmuring that he's having a connection to the earth. And that's really emphasized by the litany that he uses at the end here. This list, but it's, praising it, it's worshipping it. And he goes through the different types of timber, and you can see structurally he really breaks in form using these moments of silence, contemplative moments of silence, and even the way that he chooses to end with a term that is elongated and soft, that is then followed by the ellipsis. It's a very weak, drawn out ending. So for him in this poem, he's finding, meaning in it all, and he's spending quite a bit of time contemplating the world and contemplating life, but looking at it through the lens of wood, of timber. Now, definitely in comparison to the other two passages we have, this one is far more abstract. And if we were looking at planning of full close passage analysis, for some of you, this might be one where you go, okay, potentially I'm not going to be able to use that second passage. And as I mentioned before, that's okay, provided you at least use 2 out of the 3. It may also be one that you only briefly mention. So your analysis might carry far more material from the first and the third, and only snippets from the second, because that's all you're able to do. And again, that's okay. It is about trying to draw as much as you can from what you've got presented in front of you, and then trying to make the connections between all. If we quickly look at the last one, it's only a snippet from At the Clothesline. This one derives from the collection The Domestic Sublime. And again, it is this notion of being able to find greater sense of meaning in the mundanity of every day. What's interesting with this one is there are some really obvious connections with the first poem in particular, but the tone also matches the other two. He says, "What I'd thought a fallen shirt under the line, flat on the grass, was nothing but my shadow there, hinting that all things pass. That many we loved or used to know are dragged already out of sight, vanished fast, though stepping slow, folded into remorseless night. My dark trace now has quit the lawn. Everything slips away too soon. Yet something leaves its mark here like a rainbow ring around the moon." If we start with the structural elements to begin with, right? So even stanzas, with quartet structure, very, very straightforward. And what we can see is that he's chosen to rhyme each of the second lines. And so it gives with it a really, it increases the flow of the way it's read, but it does resolve it very nicely. It gives it a very controlled, structured feel. It also draws our attention to some of those words that are the rhyming passages. So, for example, in the first stanza, hinting that all things pass, and he uses the colon then to indicate that the rest of the poem is going to highlight what he's talking about. So when we're thinking about this idea of all things pass, he's hinting at loved ones who pass away, those relationships, as well as aging. All of those things fold into remorseless night, as he puts it. We also know that when he says, many we loved or used to know are dragged already out of sight, we know by this point in time that his son, his father, have already passed on. And so again, he's having this contemplative moment, just like he was in Shadows, in the first one within this collection. When he talks about this idea that everything slips away too soon, yet something leaves its mark here, just like the first poem, we start to see, this bleakness of death is tempered by a hopeful ending. A rainbow ring around the moon creates quite the colourful imagery, which when we start to compare it more broadly to some of the other things that are going on in these three passages that we have, it's very different to the black and white and grey that are referred to in Shadows. Okay, so starting to draw some connections to this colourful imagery, or from this colourful imagery, through to the colours that he's talking about over here. Both of them end with a sense of optimism. And if we think about the fact that the speaker, the author himself, is still writing these as somebody who's lived on, even though all of these people in his life have passed on, he's still there. He is having these moments where, in spite of his sadness, he's still alive. And so he clings to that. He may not understand all that's going on, this cycle of life and death, and the sadness that comes with it. But he understands that he's still there and he needs to keep moving on. It's hopeful and it's positive. So what we get overall with all three, really, is this contemplation of, life's cycle, birth, life, growth and death. We're starting to see, the writers contemplation about the meaning of life. And from that, we note that he doesn't necessarily come up with a response, but he's still left wondering, and he's still left just going about every day, living his life. And so this search for meaning, and that, everything in life is continuous. These are the big ideas that are being explored in this particular set of passages. Now it's going to vary with the combination of passages that you happen to have presented in front of you, but what's important is pulling them apart each individually and then considering, okay, what is some of the common threads that draw these together? Now you're going to be presented with a couple of responses to these three passages, and they're available for you on the Google site, so that way you can then consider the different ways that these three passages can be used to form a contention and a close passage analysis. But this annotation is the starting point, and it is always a challenge because you're always going to have different combinations presented in front of you. But moving through them as quickly as you can and then using them to establish a contention is the first stage of this process. Ultimately, making sure that you know the passages as well as possible, know the text that it is you're studying as well as possible, will contribute greatly to being able to do this with more ease.